What's up guys, I'm Ethan Carter and today I'm going to show you how I made this bentwood desk lamp with matching bentwood lampshades for the Rockler Bentwood Challenge. Now, this project didn't come out perfect and there's a few bumps along the way, but I really wanted to try to learn how to bend wood in a few different ways, so even though it didn't come out perfect, I learned a ton along the way and I hope you will too. Let's get to it.
For this lamp, I started by focusing on the Kerf bent wood base. I started by using my table saw and fence to cut a 3-inch wide strip of 1/4-inch plywood. For the kerf cuts, I found that leaving the top 2 plies worked out just right. Now there are plenty of websites that will give you the exact depth and width of the kerfs needed to achieve a particular bend, but for this project the only thing that's really important is consistency. So to achieve this, I made a mark on my sled and used that as a reference point to line up the back side of my previous kerf. As you can see, this little trick really helped to cut repeatable kerfs efficiently. For this base, there will be 2 kerf bent sections. One at the base that will bend a little over 90 degrees, and then a more subtle bend at the top that will allow the light to angle down instead of straight out. Next, I added some packaging tape to a piece of MDF to prevent the base from sticking to it during glue up. For the glue up, I used a brush and a bamboo skewer to work some Titebond Quick and Thick down into the kerfs before clamping the base in its shape to the MDF. This was the first part of the project that didn't work out as planned, and I got more spring back than I wanted after it dried. I ended up figuring out a solution, but if I was to make this again, I definitely would use epoxy instead. For the glue up, I just clamped the base on its side in the desired shape I was looking for, which worked, but using a form may have worked out better. Next, I decided to cover the edges of the base with some walnut veneer. 1, because who doesn't like the look of walnut, and 2, to help reduce the spring back and help the base hold its shape. I used a washer to help draw a cut line a little wider than what I needed, before using my scroll saw to cut out the rough shape. To attach the veneer, I simply placed it on the piece of MDF, made sure the base was within the cut lines, and then clamped both pieces the same way as I did before. And then repeated the same process for the other side. The pieces of veneer I had weren't quite wide enough to cover the whole base, so I did my best to match the grain pattern and glued another small piece to the end. Once everything dried, I used my router with a flush trim bit to get rid of the extra veneer. Now this router setup worked for me, and I made sure to be very careful, but this should really be done with a router table to be extra safe. I wanted to showcase the curves and also add a little bit more strength to hold its shape, so I added some medium thick black CA glue from Starbond into all of the curves. Once that dried, I used my oscillating sander to clean it all up and then carefully touch up any places that I took too much of the black CA glue off. With the majority of the base construction done, I moved on to the wooden lampshades. Now I had no idea if this would work, but rather than make some kind of complicated form, I thought I would first try using a simple funnel as the form. I started by using some cardstock to create a template that I could then use to transfer the shape needed onto the pieces of veneer. Once the shape had been transferred, I used an X-Acto knife to cut the lampshade out of some maple veneer. The cutout shape looked very familiar for some reason, and then my rebellious teenage years came back and I remembered what it reminded me of. I wanted to create a 3-tiered lampshade look for this lamp, so I made a few more. Then I moved on to bending them. I started by soaking the pieces of veneer in some hot water for about 30 minutes, and I have to admit, I was amazed at how pliable they were when I took them out. To attach them to the funnel, I simply used a bunch of mini spring clamps and just worked my way around the bottom of the funnel. The veneer started drying out pretty quickly, so I found that if I used a shirt steamer as I went, that was enough to keep the veneer pliable. After about 12 hours, the wood had completely dried and was holding its shape. To be honest, I couldn't believe it actually worked. Next, I used some wood glue to attach the two ends of the lampshade together. I also added some super glue and clamps to help hold it in place while the wood glue dried. Once it dried, I used my X-Acto knife and some sandpaper to clean up any imperfections. As I mentioned, I wanted 3 lampshades, so I repeated this process 2 more times before adding some Maker brand Simple Finish. The next step of attaching the 3 lampshades to the threaded rod was a little tricky and took some trial and error. But essentially I mixed and matched some metal and rubber washers with some spacers until I got the spacing I was looking for. The distance between the socket and the bottom of the lampshade was a little shorter than a typical light bulb, but I was able to find the small bulb at the hardware store and it worked perfectly. Next up was attaching the lampshades to the base. I just eyeballed where I thought it looked best and then drilled a hole in the center of the top portion of the lamp. With the construction done, I did some quick sanding of the base before applying some more Simple Finish. Once that dried, I could finish mounting the lampshades to the base. As you can see, there was more threaded rod than I needed, so I simply used my Dremel with a cutting disc to cut off the excess. And then all that was left was to wire it up. If this is your first time to my channel, thanks for checking it out, and if you're enjoying this video, please consider hitting that subscribe and bell button, it really helps me out. I also post a lot of behind the scenes and smaller scale projects as Ethan Carter Designs on Instagram and would love to have you follow me there as well. And with that, the lamp is done, and thanks for watching.